Hey everyone, it's Norm from Tested, and happy Friday. You saw the time lapse, you heard that music, you know it's time for another 3D printing video and a 3D printer review. And I got a big one for you this week. This is the Elegoo Jupiter. Now, I've reviewed resin printers from Elegoo before, starting with the Mars 2 Pro, a great starter printer, and what I started resin printing with. Of course, there was the Elegoo Saturn, kind of step up, a medium-sized printer, the Mars 3, which also entry-level size, very high resolution, very happy with that. And now the large size. If you think of small, medium, large printers, this is the largest printer that Elegoo has made thus far. Now, they launched this as a Kickstarter campaign back in the fall, and a ton of people backed this. I think over 5,000 people backed this. They're getting ready to ship these out, and they're able to send me one of their pre-production units that I've been testing for the past couple months. And in fact, there are some differences in this machine that were even in the earlier production units that you may have seen, like Uncle Jesse test. So we'll address that. We'll talk about some of the hardware changes, talk about my experience with it. And I'm going to divide this coverage, this review and this video into two parts. We're here in my garage, actually, because this is a massive machine and I can't bring it up to the office. So we're going to talk about the hardware and the printing experience down here, and then we'll head up and take a look at some 3D prints that came out of this machine. But let's talk about this as a piece of hardware, because first of all, it's massive. Dimensionally, the build plate and the build volume is about 50% larger than the Elegoo Saturn on each axis. So the build plate here is 11 inches by 6 inches, and the Z height is 12 inches tall. But 50% on each axis larger than the Saturn gets you a build volume that's almost 3 times as large. So you can print very, very large things on here, or a lot of small things at once. Not quite as big as the Piopoly XL printers, where you can print entire helmets. Here, you can print maybe a large face mask or a hand prop, no problem. A lot of the prints I struggled to fit onto the build plate of the Saturn or the Anycubic Mono X fit very easily on this build plate. And unlike the FDM printers out there, where they scale up relatively simply, we're talking about these 3-axis machines where you just have longer extrusion rails, you're running similar stepper motors, and maybe you have a larger build platform. And those frames, while they will they have a larger footprint, they're not nearly as big as a large resin printer, because resin printers have to be enclosed. So not only is it a bigger footprint on the table, but it's heavier and it just takes up a lot more space because you need it to be enclosed for the fumes and also for the UV light exposure, protecting the prints as they're printing. And so this is almost 90 pounds, and it just takes up an entire table in my garage here. So for the people backing this on Kickstarter, I can't imagine this is going to be their first printer, and I would not recommend this as someone's first resin printer. But the user experience for this is very similar for that of a standard mSLA printer, resin printer that you may have used, because a lot of that functionality does scale up. We're talking about just a larger UV light source underneath here, a larger masking panel in that LCD, larger build that, and larger build plate. So let's touch on each of those pieces, each of that functionality, and as well as a couple unique features of the Jupiter. So the light source underneath here, it's actually now a COB LED light source. So it's not an array of UV lights. It's this one big high-powered light that actually has its own cooling, and then that blasts up evenly across the masking panel. The LCD is probably the most important part of these printers. It's what allows these printers to have the resolution as well as the build plate size. Here they're using a 12.8-inch diagonal LCD at, they say, 6K resolution. The resolution is really closer to 5.5K. You'll see it on screen right now. But as we've talked about before, the exact dimensions and resolution by itself of these LCDs really doesn't mean much. It's the ratio of the resolution with the build plate with that screen size, because what we want to know is how small the actual pixels are. And the pixel size here is actually very similar to that of the Saturn, because the Saturn at a 4K panel, this is 50% more pixels across each axis and 50% larger build plate area. I believe the Saturn is 7.2 inches by 4.7 inches. This one's a little more rectangular. The Saturn has a 50 micron pixel size. Here, the pixel size is 51 microns, 0.051 millimeters. So theoretically, the prints out of this printer at the same scale, at the same size as the ones out of an Elegoo Saturn will look very similar, as long as your layer heights are also the same. And that's what I found as well. But with the larger plate, you can print a lot more of those things. Above the LCD is going to be the vat. And here's where the scales, the scaling up really starts to impact the day-to-day use of a machine like this, because this is a massive build vat. Not only is it larger volume, we're talking about 1.7 liters of resin that you can put in this thing, but it's heavy. It's like a 7-pound vat without the resin. It's a larger sheet of FEP on this, so if you need to replace that FEP at any time, it's a longer, more involved process to get that right, to replace that. And I did have to replace the FEP once, which we'll get to. And you're picking it up by these two big handles on the side. It does have a little lip on the corner, like your other vats, to pour out the resin, and there is a marker there for your max level. And it is secure, like other vats, by two screws, thumb screws on each side. So very similar in that sense. Uncle Jesse, when he tested his pre-production unit of the Jupiter, one thing he noticed was that the LCD was raised. It wasn't flush to the bottom of this interior cavity, and that meant that the FEP was also raised as well. And that was actually a good thing for him, because you could put this build vat on a flat surface and not worry about the FEP touching that surface. They've actually changed up the design. The LCD now is back to being flush, but thankfully there are 4 bolts on the corners of the build vat that let it raise it off the ground just a little bit. So you can still put this and set it on a flat surface. I would protect that surface as well. I use like a silicone pad, and that would protect that FEP. But just a nice, convenient thing. We'll get to the back corner of the build vat and some of the unique functionality, but I did want to talk about moving up the rail to the build plate. Now, the build plate also a massive difference. Not only is a bigger build plate here at that 11 by 6 inches, at that 12.8 inch diagonal, but it's heavier as well. It's almost 4 pounds, like 3 pounds and 12 to 13 ounces or so. And that heavier build plate means that the way it mounts to the z-axis is significantly different in this machine compared to the smaller or medium-sized machines. In a traditional smaller machine, the build plate has a bracket usually that you slide onto the z-axis rail. It hangs there. It's how you can adjust and loosen up for leveling, and then you secure it with one screw at the top. Here, leveling the build plate, there are actually 4 little bolts with springs on them that go directly onto the build plate. You loosen those up and you tighten those individually after you level and lower the z-axis all the way down to the LCD. It's a little bit of a more involved and trickier leveling process, I found. I had to do it a couple of times to get it right. And more importantly, the way the build plate locks into the z-axis, there is no frame that it kind of racks onto. Instead, what you have is this lever with one single tightening screw and a washer, and the washer presses against the z-axis mount to hold the build plate in place. Now, theoretically, that should work fine. It did work fine for the vast majority of prints that I did on this, but what I soon learned, or learned at one point, is that that washer was not the point of failure. The point of failure is actually potentially in the handle, because during one of my prints, after a print had come out, I was holding on to the handle, the metal handle on the side, gripping with one hand, and loosening the tightening handle and watching the washer get loose. Except this one time, I loosened the handle a little bit too much, and it turns out that tightening handle is not affixed permanently to the tightening screw, and the handle popped off. And when the handle popped off, the tightening screw fell, and the washer had nothing to grab onto, and the build plate went right into the vat and punctured the FEP and actually scratched up the LCD a little bit. So the unfortunate thing is that lever is not permanently affixed to that tightening screw. I don't know if Elegoo has a chance to fix that or change that in their shipping units, but for those of you getting this, you might want to epoxy that lever onto the tightening screw so there's no chance it can pop off as it did with mine and fall right into the vat of resin. It was quite a shock and my biggest issue with using this printer. It's a little bit of user error, but also something I could very easily see other people doing as well if you don't take notice. And above the build plate, there are some lights. What's different about this unit and the one Uncle Jesse tested is the lights are now cool lights, my preferred lights, and it's actually really nice to have this illuminated when you even have the door closed. And of course, it's dim because this has some tinting here, but to be able to see a print kind of rise up even if I don't have lights on in the room was actually pretty neat. And you can turn those lights off on the front panel interface if you want. The Jupiter also has two additional features that Elegoo is touting that is unique to this system. One is built-in air filtration and purification. And that actually isn't unique to Elegoo systems because remember the Mars 2 Pro had built-in air purification or filtration. But famously, or maybe infamously, that was not user serviceable at all. It was kind of embedded into the core of the machine underneath the print area. And to replace that charcoal, that filter, you require disassembling that entire machine. I don't know if anyone who actually did that. Thankfully, the filter here is very similar to the standalone filters that Elegoo sells. So you can buy these in a 2-pack. It's just a piece of charcoal at the top here. This has a tiny fan on the inside, and it runs off of a battery that you charge over USB. And the one that's in the Jupiter that it comes with is just a larger version of this with a bigger piece of charcoal. And instead of running off of battery power, there's a USB plug that sticks out of the bottom that plugs into a USB port on the back left-hand corner. And when I saw that USB port, when I opened this up and started using it, my first thought was, whoa, could I actually power other things potentially with that USB port, like a small heater or maybe like a webcam or run a USB hub? The answer is no. In fact, while that's a 24-volt output, it's only 0.7 amps. So not enough current to run anything outside of what it was designed for. And if you try plugging in a heater, that's gonna blow that port. It's gonna short it and ruin the electronics. So don't plug anything into that USB port except for the built-in air purifier. But it's a nice feature to have, and hopefully Elegoo will make replacing that charcoal pretty easily and have that readily available. The other unique feature that they've built into this machine is resin dispensing, auto resin refilling. And when I first read that, I got really excited because no other kind of mSLA printers at this price point has auto resin dispensing. The Formlab printers have that, but those have special build vats, those trays that measure the amount of resin that's in there and then electronically let the system know to open a bite valve on those resin cartridges. Here, the solution is much simpler and nothing is fancy. No electronics, actually. What they have instead is they have a port at the back of the resin vat that fits onto these caps. Now, this will come with 5 caps, and these caps have a built-in special valve. It's actually very similar to the valves that you might see on like a humidifier, a room humidifier with a water tank. You know, you kind of screw on that valve, flip that water tank upside down, and then as the water is used by the humidifier, it pulls in with just air pressure, pulls in that water. Same principle here. You have to have your resin level up to a certain point already, and then when you screw in this bottle upside down, it won't spill any resin when there's no pressure, but as the plate pushes into the resin, then this valve opens up and then more resin comes out till it's matching that resin level. Now, I end up not really needing to use that because, like I said, the resin vat here is 1.7 liters at max capacity, and nothing I print is over 1.7 liters, but the valve did work. These caps do work, and it's kind of more of a nice to have if you don't want to be pouring the resin in or you want to kind of start a new print quickly and always have your resin at full, your vat at full resin capacity. But I had no problem just between prints pouring more resin in, using my eyesight to see just how much resin I needed. So that ended up being a feature that I ended up not using a lot. Also because I was swapping between resins, different resins, and emptying the vat as I was testing this. Interface wise, it's very similar to all the touchscreen interfaces you've seen on other mSLA printers. This is running those same CTV system boards. So those have opened up to third-party slicers, thankfully. So you can use Lychee Slicer with this, but there's no Wi-Fi. It is still a USB stick that you plug into the side. You slice it on your computer, and it reads those files and those layers one at a time. So very familiar operation. And that's basically the big takeaway on the hardware side, that while everything is scaled up and the vat is heavier and the plate is heavier and it might be a little more cumbersome to do the leveling, it is operationally the same as a smaller mSLA printer. And in fact, one of the benefits of mSLA is while you can scale things up, the print times per layer stays the same. And so with the UV light here, with this mono LCD panel, print times here are still between 2.5 and 3 seconds, and a full cycle at standard speeds. Without even using room speeds, you're talking about layer times at around 10 seconds. So massive prints you can get out of this won't take 24 hours. And most of my prints at 0.05 millimeter resolution at about 3,000 layers or so were taking anywhere between 6 and 10 hours. Just very comparable to the print times on a smaller printer. Again, one of the benefits of a mSLA style printer design where the entire layer gets cured at once, and the things you're really adjusting are the layer height, how fast the z-axis is moving, if you want to use room settings or not, and how long those cure times are. And thankfully, at that 2.5 second or so cure time, prints come out of here very quickly. But speaking of those prints, let's head upstairs to the office and take a look at them up close. Okay, so I'm upstairs now in my wife Danica's office, and I have in front of me a selection of prints from the Elegoo Jupiter. And we're going to talk about a couple things here when looking up close at these prints. One, yes, the detail for sure, and how consistent that detail is on some of these prints, whether you're printing a large object or many small objects spread across a build plate, but also kind of what the benefits of having a build volume, or what you could expect of having a build volume of this size when we're talking about also having a printer of that massive size that you just saw. The first thing I want to do is do a little bit of a comparison. So for example, when I think about printers in the small, medium, or large category, this is an example of a print that comes out of the small printer. So this came out of the Frozen 8K Mini, one of the highest resolution resin printers, mSLA printers out there. And this is great for miniature scale. So this shark here is nice and long. I tried to really maximize that, that really rectangular shape of that build platform. And I was able to get this in one single monolithic piece. Now we're going to jump up from that, what I would consider a small printer, to the Elegoo Jupiter, a large printer. That same model you're able to get in a much bigger size. It is many, many times the volume, not just dimensionally, but the actual amount of space it takes up. And while I would consider this tabletop scale, this is more hand prop scale. In the one hand, it has a huge amount of presence, and you can see all the sculptural detail in that model is still there, from the scratches on the skin to the ridges to the teeth here. But it's also not unwieldy. And so if you're thinking about the Elegoo Jupiter and thinking it's going to make prints the size of giant helmets, it's not going to be able to do that. That's really optimized for prints kind of this maybe 10-inch by 6-inch by about 5-inch scale right here, printed at an angle, because you have to factor in all the supports as well. Printing this at an angle, you're never going to print that big cube that fills up that 12-inch by 11-inch by a 6-inch or so. So this, I think, is a good representation of that, printed again in one piece. And here's another comparison. This is one of my favorite stress tests for 3D printing. This Tree Rex from Hagglethorne Hollow, Johnny Fraser Allen's model. And here's another comparison with the Elegoo Mars 3 print. Again, somewhere between the small and medium size. The Mars 3 is a little bit bigger than the Mars 2 Pro. And this really, you can maximize that print volume. Here it is, that same model printed on the Elegoo Jupiter, and pretty comfortably at that. Again, many times dimensionally, not just length, width, and height, but the volume of what this takes. This is a very, very substantial print. And the detail, again, all still there. So you can see what you're going to get versus a kind of entry-level small printer versus a large voluminous printer. Both those examples were of monolithic prints that were really trying to get a big object in one go. And that's not how a lot of people print. You know, whether using a small, medium, large, a lot of these models that you get from Patreons, they come separated into parts. And here's a great example of a print that, yeah, you can absolutely do with an Elegoo Saturn or Anycubic Mono X. It's a wonderful detailed demon from Lord of the Print. And this is a model that's actually split into 15 different segments, from the main torso to the two heads, the actual arms itself. These tentacles are 3 to 4 pieces, as well as the feet and the tail, 15 different components, which was split into such so that they could be printed on a Mars 3 or Elegoo Saturn. But the benefit of the Jupiter is that all of these pieces at 100% scaling, all 15 of them fit on the bed at once. And that's pretty impressive. It's just an incredible amount of time savings if you think about not having to print over and reset up and get 15 different prints, or if you're even on the Saturn, maybe 4 or 5 different prints to get all of these pieces out in one build plate, one go, under 10 hours of printing. You can all these pieces. Just in terms of the parts management, it was so much more of a convenience, and it made printing this just more practical. I love being able to do a model like this all on one build plate, even though it was split up into those individual components. And then it handled incredibly detailed pieces like this. Like champ feathers are a really tough thing to do with a resin print. Orienting it is very tricky so that you're going to get those overhangs. And again, this really maximized the shape of that build plate, a very long design here. So I love this winged feathered creature, also from Lord of the Print, and printed just perfectly on the Elegoo Jupiter. And then in front of me are a couple other things I was able to get out of the Jupiter very comfortably, like this, a nice solid model, again, large hand prop size, bigger than the size of your fist here, that was able to fit on that build plate. And even though this is not the same model, this came out of the Saturn. So side by side, you can get a sense of just the scale. It's going to be bigger, but not an order of magnitude bigger than what you get out of the Saturn. But it is that next step up. And it shows that to get to that next step up, you do have to go with a much larger physical printer because of how these resin printers are designed. I have a couple busts here as well from Photosmint and his Patreon. And I was again able to get a couple of these stacked up on the build plate at once. And the detail just really, really lovely. I love this zombie Captain America and the texture on the suit of his, if you look up close, from that kind of faux chainmail on the front to the textured fabric on the back, shows the consistency of that detail as well as that fine line work. You can see right up into the patterning on the helmet. So it really holds up, whether you're printing something big or small. I have a direct comparison here as well. These are prints, one done on the Saturn a while ago and this more recently on the Jupiter. And looking at them, I'll show you close-ups side by side. It's pretty close. I mean, there are some places where the Jupiter actually did a better job, and that was maybe because of the way I oriented this. I've improved my orienting skills in the slicer, but the 50 micron print resolution of the Saturn versus the 51 micron of the Jupiter, yeah, they're very, very comparable, and you are again able to just do a lot more at once across the entire build plate. On the tiny miniature scale, so a figure like this, and I did a test where I had all these different characters on here just to see what the consistency would look like across one corner to the center to the other corner. And yeah, it's all there. I mean, compared to the detail you're going to get out of like the Frozen Mini 8K, I think these prints are just slightly softer. But even if you're printing tiny miniatures, the Jupiter can handle that as well. Now, I would never pick up the Jupiter just to print a few of these at once. You're going to want a smaller printer that's just more practical for printing tiny miniatures. But if you're just operating off of one printer, this does handle prints both big and small very admirably. And so that really comes down to a question of what makes most sense for the type of printing you're doing. The types of the prints of this size and this scale, yeah, you can only get prints at one go with something like the Jupiter or a larger printer. But for most people, having a printer that takes up that much space isn't going to be practical unless they have a large dedicated space for resin printing. The cleanup process as well becomes scaled up. These prints, some of these won't fit in Elegoo's own wash and cure station. I have the Anycubic Large Plus wash and cure, which many of these did fit into, but this T-Rex, for example, didn't fit in any of them. I had to go and use a 5-gallon bucket filled with some simple green to do washes on these. So it is a whole different infrastructure that's needed in addition to all the same kind of post-processing care that you need to take care of resin prints and safety as well. And all of these are considerations for whether you're looking at wanting to spend $1,300 here on a big printer. I look at what I have available to me to print now, and I don't know if I'm going to go back to the Jupiter for my day-to-day printing. The Saturn still feels like the right balance of size and detail, and I'm actually still using the Mars 3 a lot because I like that higher resolution screen, and it's just a rock solid, reliable printer. But for those of you who did back that Kickstarter, hopefully this answers some of those questions. I think there are hopefully some tweaks that they are doing yet to come in their production process to overcome some of the hiccups I had with this printer. And if you're looking to buy a new printer, whether you're experienced resin printing or new to it, I would say work your way up to a printer of the Jupiter's scale. Start with one of the small or medium-sized printers first, and all the practice and training and just reps you get on those printers, from the slicing software to the processing of prints to troubleshooting failed prints, all of that will apply when working to a printer like the Jupiter. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you found it informative and enjoyed some of these close-ups of these prints. I had a lot of fun printing these in this testing process. If you have questions about the Elegoo Jupiter or other resin printers, please post them in the comments below. But thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.